the collar. This is what we're going to be creating in this next lesson. So the collar has a little bit of structure. It's not as structured as, say, a full-on tailored collar, but it's fun to make. Now we have a lot to do, so let's get busy. Here you see the undercollar pattern piece with the face fabric. We also have cut this out of muslin and the tailoring canvas. Now I've worked ahead and I've drawn the stitching lines on one of the sides, but you want to draw the stitching lines on the tailoring canvas because this is going to be a stitching guide for our next step. So again, seam allowances are 1/2 inch, so that you measure in a 1/2 inch, and there we have that. So we are prepared for the next step. This is what I call framing the canvas. What we're doing here is we're replacing the seam allowances of the canvas with something much thinner, so that when you install this into a garment section, you don't have to worry about pressing, because the stitching line will be right about there. The muslin is far more flexible and easier to sew and easier to press. So let me show you how we make that. I worked ahead and pinned one of the canvas pieces to the muslin. And so here, again, you just want to line up the cut edges and pin. Okay. Now we have both pieces pinned off to the sewing machine. We can use either a zigzag or a serpentine stitch. I'm using the serpentine stitch. The stitch width is 5.0, the stitch length is 2.0. And what you want to do is you want the zigzag to be just ever so slightly inside the pencil line. And if you're wondering, err on the side of a little too far in rather than too far out, because we're going to cut away the canvas right on the pencil line. So, and then the cut edge will be our stitching guide for later. Now this doesn't have to be pretty. You can use any old thread because this will be inside the garment. We have one finished, so I'll let you see what it looks like. There it is. And yes, we're being watched, just so you know. So I will go off camera, sew the other one, and then I'll meet you back at the work table. So here we are. We have both sides of the collar stitched. The next step is to trim. You want to trim close to or just slightly inside that pencil line. Now notice, this is a little trimming tip, Notice how as I'm going along, I have the cut edges facing my palm. Now, the natural tendency for a lot of people is to come at it this way. The drawback is, first off, you end up cutting what's underneath. Also, you can't get so close. So how I like to think about it in my mind is like sliding a letter opener right along those zigzag stitches, because this cut edge is going to be your stitching guide later. So you want it to be as accurate as possible. So this is step 1. Step 2, we want to trim out the excess muslin on the inside. You don't want to have this hanging out inside your garment. It doesn't do any good. Because really what this muslin is doing is, like I said, we're creating a frame. And once I trim this away, I will explain why we're doing this. Okay, here we are. So let me explain. This side will go against the back of the face fabric. This will be inside. So when you stitch, you're going to stitch right outside the cut edge. So what will get caught in the seam is the muslin, not the canvas. You catch canvas in a seam, it makes it impossible to press flat. You have to get a hammer and tongs to flatten it. So this is one. I will go off camera and trim the other one. Okay, here we are. We have both pieces. Our next step will be applying them to the face fabric. This is where we apply the canvas to the back of the face fabric. Now, a little explanation here. This is the side that we want to go against the back of the fabric. The reason for this is that when we're sewing, the stitch will sit right about there, and if there's any read-through that might occur, the muslin acts as a buffer. If we actually were putting it this way, say if you have the canvas closer to the back of the fabric, what would happen, especially if it's a thinner fabric, you might get a read-through of this crease when you're pressing, and it would show on this side, and then you would really regret it. So this is the thing to remember. The back of the fabric, muslin, canvas on the back. So knowing that, we're going to pin this together and tailor baste. For those who don't like to baste, there are times I try to get away without basting, but that's ready to wear. That is not what we're doing here. We want something better. So this is what it's going to look like. This is called a tailor baste. The tailor baste, generally you don't put a knot in your thread because you don't want to have to worry about it creating bumps. Stitch a couple of times to anchor. So the stitch runs perpendicular to the line of travel. You don't have to pull it tight, you just want it to hold the two layers together. The beauty of this particular stitch, it's somewhat like a pad stitch. Actually, it's a bigger pad stitch. It will stretch a little bit if you need it to. And when you get to the other end, secure your thread. Voila. So here, we are now ready to pin the two center back seams together, and I want that point there to match that corner there. So we're matching up those corners, and same at this end. There we are. Those two corners match. And then we pin baste because we want to sew just outside those cut edges. So we're pinned. Now let's go over to the machine and sew. Now you can see I have put on my zipper foot. This is just a little precaution I like to take because you have fewer thicknesses here, more thicknesses here. So having the zipper foot on makes it so that these thicknesses don't really create a drag on the seam as you're sewing. This is standard 2.5 stitch. Notice you're stitching just outside that edge. Okay, so let's show you the result. So see, the stitch is just outside that edge there, and here as well. So now I'll take this over to the pressing table, give it a press. I'll meet you at the pressing table. So we press as sewn. And here, this is where I like to get out my seam roll. And press this over the seam roll. Back to the work table. To control the seam allowances, I like to just sew a little bit of a catch stitch. So you're catching the seam allowance just to the canvas. And you can see I'm using a bright orange thread. You can use any color you want because it's going to be inside the garment. It'll be your little secret. Now this is what I call my catch stitch. I'm not using the absolutely dead correct 100% classic catch stitch because honestly, this is inside the garment and this is quicker. So as you can see, this stitch it's 45 degrees to the line of travel, and you take 2 bites at once. So like I said, it's not dead correct couture, but it works nonetheless. So now let me secure the thread. Okay. And then one thing I like to do here is to come in and trim down the seam allowances to about 1/8 of an inch. So that when we come across here or here, you don't have a ginormous bunch getting caught in that seam when you're stitching. This is just preemptive bulk reduction. think we can make that as a term, preemptive bulk reduction. Okay, there's our center back seam. We're ready for the next step. Now this is where you'll be glad you did your tailor basting on the lower part of your collar. We're going to be shaping it over the ham. So what you want to do, I like to anchor center back with a pin, and then bring it around so that the two fronts match. Now let me pin this and then I'll show you what I'm up to here. Okay, so this is the back, and we want the two roughly to meet at the center front. And from here, we're going to build the turn of cloth in. So here, as you can see, and you want to have that cut edge of the neck seam is going to be a little higher than this. This is going to overlap it a little. And so now what you're going to see here is you're going to see the turn of cloth. The face fabric is going to hang out from the edge. That's what you want. From here, I'm going to give it some steam. And now we're going to let the turn of cloth, we're going to let that occur. We can trim that off later. From here, I have more basting thread prepared, and then we're going to tailor baste the outer edge of this collar. Now, notice I have my hand underneath. You don't want to risk basting the two layers together or basting the collar to the ham, which I have done, and it's deeply embarrassing when that happens. So these basting stitches obviously will come out later. So I will work around to the other side and bring you back the result. So here we have the tailor basting, which makes this all now ready for the next step, which is the pad stitching. So here you have the collar shaped, and if you lay it out flat, what you can see is that it really doesn't want to lay flat anymore because you've actually built some turn of cloth into it. So the pad stitching, the first row of pad stitching, I'm going to pad stitch kind of on the top of this fold, and then the pad stitching will be a little more dense in what's called the stand of the collar, and it will be a little more sparse on the fall, or the flap. So what that's going to look like, for those who've never done pad stitching before, the object here, it's like a very tiny tailor baste, and the object is just to barely catch the fabric underneath. If you get it right on a textured fabric like this, you just won't see it. So you anchor your thread, and then it's just a little tiny tailor baste. The needle points 90 degrees to the line of travel. The stitches are, I'd say, about 3/8 of an inch apart. You don't have to pull it too tightly. You just want to marry these, the interfacing and the body, fabric together. Now, one thing to know about is you notice I'm using single strand, and I iron the thread. Debates rage over whether you wax your thread or not. I don't wax the thread because this is polyester thread, and wax doesn't have anywhere to go if you iron it. If you're using a cotton thread, yes, absolutely you would wax it because that lubricates the thread and it also preserves it. But for polyester, I iron, and that makes it so it sews without any trouble. Now I will go all the way around and finish and bring back the result. Here we are at the end, and obviously, because this is such a high texture, you don't see the stitches in this fabric. Now, one way to gauge a stitch to see that you've picked enough fabric but not too much, as you can see here, my finger is starting to get chewed up. I do this by feel. If the needle, I know how much, if the needle will scrape just on my fingertip, I know that I've gotten enough. So you can see here, so I have sewn to here. Next, I'm going to fill in the stand. Now the second row of stitches, I like to take the bite midway between these two. Just a personal preference. You don't have to. You can have them line up. I just find it controls it better. And when hand sewing, like I said, I iron the thread, and also you don't want the thread much longer than the distance from your hand to your elbow, because what you run into then is you're wrangling too much thread and you waste time with the thread that you wrangle. So that's, some people think that by threading a needle with like 2 yards of thread in it, they're saving time. They're actually not. It gets caught on everything. It tangles. It's just a mess. So if you don't have that as part of your hand sewing habits, get into it. So now I'm just going to turn around and come back the other way, because that's really what we're going to be doing. So again, third row, we just turn around and come back the opposite way. And so what's going to happen is the stitches are going to angle towards each other. That's how they get that. It's just going up one row and down the other. Now, one thing I have seen, this is what I hate about single thread, it comes undone. So what I have seen people do is use a blind hem machine for pad stitching. Now I've tried it. I find it's just much easier for me just to hand sew it. It's quicker too, and more satisfying. It's very meditative. So I'm going to sew down to this end, and then I will go off camera and finish filling in one side, because this is like watching paint dry if you're not doing it yourself. Okay, so secure the thread here. So you can see the stitches kind of point towards each other. That is as it should be. I will go off camera and fill in the rest of this here and bring it back. So here is one half of the collar. You can see also I have removed the tailor basting because it has served its purpose. Now I will work ahead and pad stitch the other side of the collar, because once we have this filled, we want to deal with the flap. I will be back with the results. We're almost done. Okay. So now, just flatten this out, give you a long view. There. We have the stand pad stitched. Now we want to pad stitch the flap. That is not so dense. We're going to run the stitching lines, I'd say about 3/8 of an inch apart, but then I'm going to show you a little trick for the corners. I have the first row past the roll, about 3/8 of an inch away. Now, this is where I'm going to show you a little trick here. I'm going to take some of this basting loose. And just put a pin there for now. So this is a square. This is just muslin. It can be cut on the bias or it can be cut on the straight grain. It is about 2.5 inches deep. And what we're going to do is we're going to put it between the two layers. So you can see it sits there. And so if we look, okay, there's the edge. So it's good to see the edge. That's what we want to know, that piece right there. Because we can trim away everything else later. But what we're going to do now is we're going to sew pad stitches across and through this little piece of muslin that we have installed. The object here is we don't want our collar points to wing up like donkey ears. And so this is a little reinforcement that you can do. So the first row secures the little piece of muslin between the layers. And then the second row we start the work. So now, we want to curl this over our hand. With each row of stitching, we're going to build a curl. We want this to tend to want to pull around. So we're going through all the layers with the pad stitch, and the stitches are closer together, the rows are closer together. We want more control in this area. And so again, I'll sew one more row and then continue off camera. So you can see we're starting to build a roll in there. So I will just continue and keep rolling this, and I will bring it back when I'm finished. Okay. So, you can see this is really what we want. We want that to pull backwards. From here, I will fill in the rest of the pad stitching and bring it back to show you the result. And here is the finished pad stitched collar. Now these ends we're going to press flat when we go to the pressing table, but before we go to the pressing table, we just want to trim off any excess muslin so it doesn't hang us up later. Now that that's done, we will take this over to the pressing table and press. First, we want to press the collar point. So you can see that will flatten out. And then you want to press that side and then come in. And press this side. So I will repeat on the other side. Press the point. Press that and the stand. Here we are. So from here, I also like to just give a little bit of stretch. If you stretched it too much to join it to the upper collar, no big deal. So here we have the undercollar. Next, we will join the undercollar with the upper collar. Here we have the upper collar, and what I have done is I've cut 2 snips at the center back so that we can match that to the undercollar. And before we join the two, I'm going to just stretch this starting at center back. Now it's not going to stretch a lot. It will stretch more or less depending on your fabric. But what this does, you can see here, pull out a little bit, you can see this little bit of lift here. This is going to make the upper collar sit better on the neck. And since this is cut on the cross grain, you're going to get a little more stretch. So we will go now to the work table and join this to the undercollar. One thing you want to do before you join the undercollar to the upper collar is trim off any of this edge that may have found its way out, because you want the cut edge of the muslin to be your stitching guide. So there's not a lot here to trim, but it doesn't hurt to be accurate. Okay, ready to join the two. Now I've worked ahead matching the center back and matching the cut edges of the upper collar with the under collar. Now you can put more or fewer pins in. I'm going to be using more pins. So then from here to here, what I'm looking at is I want to match first the corner and work backwards from the corner. So match the corner there. Now I'm pin basting. You could, after you have it all pinned, you could hand baste it. That's entirely okay. Now you notice the upper collar is a little bit longer. That's a good thing. You just turn it like this and they will match, so that when you sew them together, you won't get a buckle on the undercollar. Also, with the undercollar, it's on the bias, so it's going to conform to the upper collar. There we are. Matched to the corner. And then now I like to have these two edges match, because you want a little extra on the upper collar so it comes up and over and matches the curve. Don't pin them one to one, because see, your collar is going to roll over like that, so you want the two layers. It's better to pin them in the contour that they will be living in the garment. It just makes for better sewing. So now what I will do is I'm going to do the little trick at the corners that I showed you to turn the corners. Now, if you remember the little trick I showed you turning the corners on the cuff latch, I'm doing the same thing here. You can see I'm using black buttonhole thread, and I'm actually wanting to catch it through the muslin, because that is going to be a little stronger than catching it through the face fabric. So now that we're all set up and ready to go, let's go to the machine. And we're going to start out, as you can see I'm using my zipper foot because I do love it. We're going to start out with a standard 2.5 stitch. And we're going to sew right next to that cut edge. Now when we get to here, I'm going to shorten the stitch to 0.75, and we're going to go just outside that little loop. And then turn it 2 or 3 stitches. Turn again. So for another 1/4 to 3/8 of an inch at that stitch length, lengthen the stitch back, and continue on. And again, shorten the stitch to 0.75. Come just outside the little thread loop. 2 or 3 stitches. Stitch for about 1/4 to 3/8 of an inch. Lengthen the stitch back to the 2.5. And finish. Okay, so let me show you the result here. So you can see, and that little loop then remains intact, so you can trim really close. We'll trim that out, but let's do all of that at the pressing table. Our first step is to get rid of this little bit of seam allowance. You don't need it, it adds bulk. And see, aren't you glad you engaged in preliminary bulk reduction? From here, we're going to press as sewn. And now I want to press the seam allowances open, so that will require the point presser. As we did on the cuff latch, it's much easier to press seam allowances open before you trim the corners. So I'm just, as you can see, I'm pressing the ends first. And then I will press this edge here. And here we are, pressed. Next, trimming. So the trimming, you're going to cut right across there. And again, that's why you have those extremely short stitches. And then I'm going to trim a steep angle here and a steep angle here. From here, I will trim the undercollar seam allowances to 1/4 inch, or half of the 1/2 inch, just half the seam allowance. So I will go a little ways here. So that's what our trimming will look like. I will continue on to the other end and bring back the results. Now that everything is trimmed, we can turn this right side out. So the first pass at this is going to be using the point turner to try to get this turned as much as possible. And then here is the thread, the anchor thread. See, is that not a thing of beauty? Now I'll trim that off later. Now let me turn the other one. You know, there are many different ways to turn corners crisply, and you know, I'm always looking for that one that works the best, and this seems to work pretty darn well. So yeah, so we turn this, and you're pushing really on the undercollar side because you've got more canvas. You've got more support. And then when you get it as far out as you can push it, then take it the rest of the way out with this. And you can use this to pull to press, and then you trim it off later. So now that we're turned right side out, this is where we start to press. Now we're going to favor the edge to the undercollar. And so I'm going to get out the pressing ham. I just think it's going to be better. And the pressing cloth. So if you can't really see this, I don't want to mar this fabric because someone is actually going to be wearing this. So, pressing cloth. And yes, pressing it over a ham because it is going to live on the body. It's not going to live on a flat surface. So I just like pressing curves over a ham when you absolutely want it to sit flat. There we are. So let me press this, and I will come back and show you the results. Okay. So there is our corner. I'll trim that off later. And you can see the seam favors to the back. That's as it should be. Might have to favor that just a tiny bit. And so next, what I want to do is to baste around the collar edge. So this is our beloved tailor baste again. We want these edges to sit nice and flat. And you want to baste that curve in. Okay, so we're done with this. We can trim these off. And it's starting to look like a collar. Next, we want to build in the turn of cloth for the upper collar. So what I'm going to do here is smooth this out flat and fold and pin because we want to make sure that the fabric is snug up against each other. Now, what you're going to see here, that's not going to kill you. That's why I do this. We add a turn of cloth in that is actually added to the upper collar, but sometimes, depending on the thickness of the fabric, you're going to have a little mismatch. That's not going to kill you. So what I will do here is just come in here and pin and center back, match the center back. And once I pin that, I will go off camera and tailor baste that and bring it back here. Okay, we have these layers basted together. Now you can unpin these. So you've built your turn of cloth in. Now it's going to want to sit nicely. So our next step will be going to the machine to do a machine baste at 1/2 inch to hold all of these layers together. This is just a machine baste at 1/2 inch. That will be in the seam allowance. And now we will take this over to the pressing table and shape it on the ham to finish. As you can see, I have it so that the seam allowance goes underneath the edge of the collar and it meets at the center front. And it really just needs a little steam. There you are. A thing of beauty. Now one thing, see how that curves down? That's what you want. That will make it so that your points don't look like donkey ears. So there is the collar. Back to the work table. And here we have details. We have the collar, which turned out quite nicely, if I may say so myself. And we have the cuff latches. Now, this is where we would have a discussion of top stitching, because up until now we haven't really needed it, but I do think that we want to talk about it. There are different methods for top stitching. What I'm going to be choosing for this particular fabric will be a little different than what you might choose because there is such a texture on this fabric. But our next topic is musings on top stitching.